The Police and Crime Commissioner will set the style and priorities for the force. Today, the 5 people who want that job are here. Welcome to Politics West. Morning all. Hello, it's great to be with you ahead of Election Day on May the 6th. It will come round before we know it. Now, one of the people in this studio this morning will be the new Police and Crime Commissioner for Avon and Somerset, the largest police force in the West. And it's an exciting day for me because this is the first time we've had guests in the studio for more than a year. My huge thanks to everybody here for taking a rapid COVID test. We're all negative, including me. It's chilly because we have the ventilation on full blast, and we are the correct distance apart, even though some camera angles don't always show it. So, having jumped through all those hoops, let's meet the candidates. For the Conservatives, we have Mark Shelford. Kerry Barker is standing for Labour. For the Lib Dems, Heather Shearer. Cleo Lake for the Green Party, and John Smith is an independent. Thank you all so much for coming. We'll hear from you in just a moment or two. But first, Robin Markwell has been looking at what the job of Police and Crime Commissioner is and what the winner will have to do.
After a summer of unrest, a winter of deep discontent. These are volatile times, with policing in the limelight like never before.
Where police have formed this barrier here, they're protecting the central police station.
So the politician responsible for setting the direction of the Avon and Somerset force has a huge task ahead. Police and crime commissioners are in charge of the big picture stuff. They set the police budget, they lay out the priorities for policing in their police and crime plan, and they hire and can fire their chief constables.
This role is all about being a bridge between the public and the police. And what matters to voters here in inner city Bristol is very different to what matters here on the Mendip Hills and down on the Somerset levels. The Avon and Somerset police force area is hugely diverse. Cultural crime consultant Malia Berridge spent 34 years as an officer with Avon and Somerset. Here's her job description for the next commissioner.
It needs to be somebody with integrity, somebody who is transparent, has a very good grasp of policing, and the police force is a regimented force. So you need to understand how the ranking structure works. It's not a business. It needs somebody who is going to say no to the communities or no if something is not right. So it needs somebody with a strong character and somebody who's open and willing to listen.
We're guaranteed a new face in charge. The previous Commissioner, Sue Mount-Stevens, is standing down. So too is the most senior police officer, Andy Marsh. So one of the first jobs for our new Commissioner will be one of the biggest, finding a new Chief Constable.
Thank you, Robin, for that very much. Well, we'll have a general debate in just a moment or two, but let's just let the audience get to know you a bit. I'm going to ask you one or two very straightforward questions. Kerry Barker, you're a barrister and experienced at cross-examination. What's your verdict on Avon and Somerset, and what would you change?
Well, if you ask people what's the purpose of the police, they'll tell you it's to prevent crime and catch criminals. And if that's the test, the last 9 years has been a disaster, because crime's gone up, but the detection rate has gone rapidly down. And so if you look at things like violent and sexual crime, in 2012, there were just under 18,000 offences reported to the police, and the detection rate was just under 50%.
So what would you do?
Well, what's gone wrong? What's gone wrong has been the abandonment of local policing in the way it was in 2010. And we need to rebuild that. We need to stop closing police stations because that gives a totally wrong message to people. And we need to bring back the specialist teams, which were very good, for example, at dealing with victims of sexual assault, because they empathise with them. They were experienced.
You've got to have the money, of course, to do all that.
You've got to change the way you use existing resources then.
OK. Now let's move on to Cleo Lake. You're a Green candidate, a former Lord Mayor, and you're an activist. What would you bring to the top job?
I bring my experience, I bring the work I've done with communities to represent, and it's an incredibly, it's a big privilege to take on this role. You have the ability to change lives and transform communities. My slogan is with communities, for communities, and it's incredibly important to me that I'm able to outreach, be transparent, listen, and also really kind of promote the role of PCC, because it's quite clear that a lot of people don't really understand or even know the role exists. So I think the element of promoting the role is really important. There needs to be, in my view, an element of institutional reform. In fact, the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners did their own racial disparity audit and report last December, where they concluded on a number of matters, which included having a far more diverse workforce and other matters of disproportionality.
How to achieve all those things, though?
Absolutely. It's about scrutiny. Of course, the role is about holding the police to account. So it's about, for me, supportive scrutiny. And I'd like to draw on my experience of, since 2017, I've been with the Avon Fire Authority, and I think that puts me in a good position to lead transformational change.
Okay, presumably a green force as well.
Absolutely. Has the constabulary declared a climate or an ecological emergency? This is important, and I do support things like more officers on bicycles, and of course that crosses over with some of the road safety elements of my priorities as well.
Mark Shelford, you're the Conservative standing. You spent 20 years in the army, so you're used to barking out the instructions. Do you see Avon and Somerset as a police service or a police force?
It's a really good question, and it's clearly a little bit of both, but it is a service to the public about keeping people safe, and they do an extremely good job in doing that. Frontline police officers are fantastic. So I would like to return to the Peelian principles of preventing crime.
Robert Peel.
Exactly. Who started the police, who was the Minister of the Home Secretary and then the Prime Minister. And then I want to do 3 priorities of action. The first is to reassure the public the police are there for them. That's about visible policing. It's also about making communities more resistant and resilient to crime. Second, I want to refocus the police on fighting crime, particularly those ones that the public are very concerned about: violence, drugs, antisocial behaviour, dangerous driving. And then finally, I want to rebuild the morale of the police, and by making them more efficient and effective. And that's particularly around working with communities.
OK, you want to rebuild the morale of the police, but they would say, well, their morale was dented by many years of austerity that the Tory government, the Conservative government, introduced.
Yes, but we're now in a new time, a new period.
Was that wrong? Was that wrong, the austerity?
It was appropriate for the time, but we're now moving forward. And as you know, the Prime Minister has committed to an additional 20,000 police officers, and within
Which
Avon
will
and
replace
Somerset,
the people that were fired.
Within Avon and Somerset at the moment, we're back to over 3,000, I think, and 67 police officers with an aim to get to 3,155. So we're on the uptake, and money is being put back into the police service.
OK, just going randomly, really. John Smith, you're an independent.
Yes.
And you were, until very recently, the deputy to Sumant-Stevens, who's standing down now. So I guess it will be steady as she goes if you take over the force.
Well, Mark's made an important point that actually the big difference from Sue's time is that Sue had to manage cuts of 30% in terms of central government funding and a reduction of 700 police officers. So it plays into Kerry's point, really, to compare 2012, when you had 700 more officers, with 2019, when you had a massive reduction, plus a big increase in complex crime, is not a fair comparison of how the force has been performing over that time. A fair comparison would be to look at how the force has managed its reduced resources, which is what the National Inspectorate does. It compares it with other forces, and on its latest inspection reports, Avon and Somerset is ranked in the top 5 in the country. So I think that's a fair analysis of how it's performed over that period.
OK, just looking, when I've been to police headquarters, you've got a little wing now, haven't you, for the Police and Crime Commissioner. How many people work directly for the PCC?
24.
Is that quite a lot, do you think?
Not for the size of the force. It's well beneath the average spend for a PCC's office. It's about half the level of the average level of spend for a police in terms of the percentage of the budget.
Okay.
And the PCCs have a big role. We've all been describing in our manifestos all the things that we want to do. And the government keeps giving us extra things. As you've seen their latest announcements, they're going to give them even more responsibilities. So you can't do all those things without having people come in and provide the relevant expertise.
Okay. Heather Shearer, for the Lib Democrats. You were on the police and crime panel that voted against an increase in funding that the former PCC asked for. Why was that?
Another good question, actually. As has been mentioned by some of our colleagues here, the government did actually effectively cut the government funding coming in this year, kept it at zero increase. And in a sense, the government was asking the local residents and taxpayers to make up that shortfall. The people who sit on the panel are all representatives of local areas, and they didn't feel that in the time of COVID we needed to be actually making people who are already under some real struggle financially pay for what the government was not paying for.
Okay.
So we just went to veto it. But of course, the other thing is that having done that, the new budget that came forward, which was lower, still actually delivers all of the things that were supposed to be being delivered with the higher amount.
OK, so if you were PCC, you're in charge, you would be going to that panel, presumably, and asking for extra money, or would you not?
No, absolutely would be. I'm happy to be asking for extra money.
So you vetoed it when you were on the panel, and now if you were PCC, you'd ask for more?
Because the reason it was vetoed last time was that we were not convinced that we had seen enough increased performance. There are so many, only 1 in 10 burglaries which have a positive outcome, as they call it, which actually get solved. We have people who feel that they cannot, there's no point in ringing the police because they feel they're not going to get their calls answered, or in fact nothing would happen as a result. So if we had seen the actual increase in performance, then we would have been happy to have gone for the higher amount. OK, so if you're in charge, any increase in funding will be linked to performance? I think it would have to be.
OK.
Could I come back on that point, David? Because I think
quickly,
the one point that I would say is that in terms of the relative share of the budget that Avon and Somerset gets, it actually gets a low share per head, so 21 million less than it should do on the average spend. So unfortunately, as 80% of the PCCs in the country took the full maximum amount by vetoing the budget, Avon and Somerset is unfortunately even further behind.
OK, you've got a crafty second bite at that, Sherry.
I will.
Now I'm going to leave the hard work to you and take more of a backseat, I hope, so you can debate among yourselves. So do feel free to chip in. The question is about protest. Have the police been too tough or too soft on recent demonstrations? Who would like to go first?
I'll start.
OK, you start.
I think the police showed terrific, courageous restraint when dealing with those riots, which were outrageous. The mob should attack the police, the very people who keep us safe. There were peaceful protests, which were absolutely fine, and then it became a public order issue which the police had to engage with, and I fully support what they did.
OK.
I think it's a traumatic experience for both our police and protesters, people who quite rightly are standing against this police crime and sentencing bill because they know that their rights to peaceful protest are under threat. And we also know that marginalised communities also feel in danger of having their way of life scrapped effectively by this bill. So the right to protest is absolutely important. Of course, it was heightened by the COVID restrictions, and we've seen a change in policing since those have been lifted. I do not agree with how some of the protests were handled by the police. Of course, there are other elements to it, and I think it's incredibly important, and I've called for an independent inquiry, and that is one of the things that I'm committed to should I be elected.
Would that, would that undermine the police if they have to go through an inquiry into this?
I think it's actually something that's unprecedented. I think the process that I would go down is something new. So it is also about hearing from officers who are there, hearing from protesters who are there, learning. And as I've said, it's supportive scrutiny.
So
we need to be mindful of what might be coming down the road and be realistic and do the best that we can to serve, protect and respect.
OK. Who's next?
I think Avon and Somerset's got a long history of facilitating peaceful protests. We saw that last summer, Cleo, didn't we, at the BLM march? Sunday, the 21st of March, was not a peaceful protest, however you describe it. It was extremely violent. The two subsequent marches both happened, as Cleo said, when protest was actually not allowed under the rules. And since then, the police have actually managed to facilitate peaceful protests again. So I think there's no need for a public inquiry. I agree with the tactics that have been adopted. Where individual officers, concerns have been raised that they've, in carrying out their duties, they've been excessive, I think it's right that's looked at. And I know the Independent Office of Police Conduct has looked at some of the cases. So I don't think there's a need for a further inquiry. I stand by the tactics that the police adopted.
Well, I think as well, I have a lot of sympathy for the officers, principally for the officers, because I don't think they should ever have been asked to suppress peaceful protests at all. I think as well there was the confusion around they were being asked really to suppress, they were being asked to enforce a law which was essentially in direct contradiction to an existing law, which is around peaceful protest or around the right to free speech. And I think it was the police officers who were really, in a sense, hung out to dry, really, by the senior leadership there. I think it was senior leaders and government, probably. And I think they all... I had so much sympathy. Underneath a uniform is a human person, a human being. And nobody wants to see violence of that kind against anybody.
But people watching... some of them, haven't been, me included, haven't hugged our kids for a year. Yeah. We haven't been able to go to funerals.
Absolutely.
Weddings have been cancelled. So if you have that strict rule on one side and say, oh, well, protest is all right, how can you justify that?
No, it isn't an easy justification, but the right to free speech and the right to
trumps everything, including COVID.
Well, I think it probably did, if they were doing it the right way and keeping their distances. And as John was saying, there are ways in which you can actually negotiate ahead of time to make protests work well. So I think that could have been done. So I would still protect free speech.
We haven't heard from you yet, Kerry.
No. The point has got to be surely that unlawful violence is wrong however it's committed. The scenes we saw on the Sunday night were dreadful. And there were a bunch of thugs there attacking the police. My worry is that, looking back over the past 9 years, the chances of those people being caught is 1 in 10. Because with public order offences, the detection rate is down below 10%. Been a massive change since 2012. And you stopped me previously when I was telling you about violence and sexual offences. They've gone up from 18,000 to 47,000. The detection rate's gone down from 50% to 12%.
Yeah, I understand you want to work on detection.
We've got real problems there. So we were problems in catching the people who were violent to the police. But so also we saw on the Friday night some instances of police officers hitting people who were sat on the ground, hitting them with their shields and with their batons. And that's also unlawful. And we have to detect those crimes too.
Does anyone think that it might be difficult to understand the rules, given the different styles of policing which we've seen for different demonstrations? For the Extinction Rebellion, the Bristol Bridge was sealed off and people protested there. For the Black Lives Matter, the police stood by while the Colston statue was toppled and so on. So perhaps people think, well, Bristol is a city of protest. Is that right?
Well, Bristol has a history of protests, of course.
Well, most cities do.
Yeah.
A famous history of protests going back to 1831, the burning of Bristol there.
Yeah.
But
I think I was there.
And you're not as old as me, so. If we look, however, at what took place even on that Sunday night, the policing of the protests originally was perfectly acceptable. The violence against the police at the end by a bunch of thugs was not acceptable.
Okay.
Again, looking at it from all sides and, you know, with the view as well of down the line being able to build cohesion, because that's what I'm about. It is about building these bridges, and we're seeing more polarisation now. So there's also a role for the PCC in that. I think I agree, you know, some of the scenes we've seen of peaceful protesters, people sat down being, you know, hit with shields, etc. And for officers to say that that's part of our training, I think that should be reviewed. It's an incredibly difficult job to be a frontline police officer in that situation. You do have an element of discretion and how you handle things. Yeah. But, you know, we need to be mindful as well of what we say, of what is said following these incidences, which again at the moment haven't added to some public confidence.
Okay. Have they convinced you at all? Has Cleo convinced you that perhaps more even-handed verdict?
No. As I said, I was fully supportive of what the police did and how they go about their work. Can there be lessons learnt from live operations? Of course there can be. And I've been in those live operations personally. I know how scary it is for the front line in a riot. And so I think I agree with John from the point of view that if there have been specific instances of more than reasonable force being used by the police, they should be investigated. But as a whole, I think the police showed courageous restraint.
Lessons learned, absolutely. And, I think we should reflect on the times when it has gone right. And again, I've also had that experience of sitting in Silver Command and seeing how peaceful protests can be policed in a better way.
I'd just like to ask John just one last question. The Chief Constable is leaving, and now his contract was up in July anyway. But
That's right.
Is his departure anything to do with the policing of those protests?
Not at all. He's served well over his term, David. He's been an excellent Chief Constable, and I think once all the political sniping over the protests ends, the history books will record he's left Avon-on-Somerset in a much better place than he found it, and what a good chief he's been. OK,
let's move on. Our next topic is about the differences within the force area from East Coker in Somerset to East Bristol. How do you make sure all the resources aren't sucked into the big towns and cities? Heather, you're from the Mendips.
Yes.
So let's start with you. I mean, this has been going on ever since Avon-on-Somerset was formed. Always complaints from people in Somerset that they don't get a fair share.
That's absolutely right. And that is what I hear a lot of the time from my constituents or people who I speak to down in Somerset. But to be fair, I hear a lot of complaints, if you like, about the police or their responsiveness in both places. I mean, one of the things I would really like to do is to restore faith, really, in the police through increasing the community policing function. And that should be everywhere, I think, across the entire force, so that people they can feel safe on the streets, they know that the officers are there, that they know the area. And they should be everywhere.
It's typically in Bristol, isn't it? You've got the drugs, you've got lots of other city issues that you don't see in Taunton or perhaps in East Coker, one of my favourite villages. That you just don't see it. So, but people in those villages will say, well, I don't see a policeman, a police officer. When my house is burgled, they don't turn up.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's 48% of people in the last year, that was 19-20, in the recent crime surveys say that they've never seen a foot patrol. Now, that's national, but exactly what you're saying is right. And my thought is that what we need to do as well is we need to prevent crime where possible, and some of those areas that you've talked about, like East Coker or some of the more rural areas, they are hotbeds of rural crime. They're the place that county lines get their kind of foothold. And if you're going to be serious about breaking the cycle of crime and about preventing crime, which I think we should be, you have to make sure that those things happen as well. You can't just go where the big numbers are, because you're losing faith.
Right. John, I made a sweeping statement, you ring about a burglary and the police don't turn up. That was probably unfair, is it? Or do the police not turn up to every burglary?
No, the police respond to burglary.
They don't turn up to every burglary, that's the question. They don't turn up.
No, well, the point I would come back to on Heather's point is that there are a lot less officers over the last few years than there have been. Since 2019, when we have been able to increase the number of officers, not through the central government funding, but through council tax, we've reinstated a specialist team, which we only moved away from because of the reduction in numbers and the increase in complex demand. We reintroduced this specialist team, Operation Remedy.
Having scrapped it?
Yeah, absolutely, David. And we didn't want to scrap it, but when you have 20% less officers and you have an increasing demand in complex sexual cases, I'm afraid difficult decisions have to be made.
Burglary is a big crime, isn't it? I mean, it has a terrible impact on families.
Burglary is a big crime, and it has been shown with this proactive team. In the first year of operation, burglary is down by 10% and the detection rate doubled. So I agree, it's really important.
I need us to move it along, Kerry.
Well, no, you're right about rural crime. I mean, if you take places like the constituencies of Frome, North Somerset, West Somerset, we're talking about 1 in 10. It's 1 in 20 in those places in terms of burglary.
Well, and Kerry, so if I may say as well, the doubling that John mentioned was from 4% to 8% of successful
rural
completion.
Crime comes within the category of other thefts, mainly, in the police stats. The detection rate for other thefts is down to 4%.
Well, I think, again, the right thing to do is to compare it nationally.
But
at 8%,
no,
that level is top
the question
quartile.
is where you put your resources.
Exactly, but you see, it's not right to question nationally. The point about it is what service are you providing for the people of Avon and Somerset? And to say, oh, well, we're as good as North Yorkshire or whatever is not good enough. When we look at the figures that show how bad we are, we've got to do things differently.
I was in West Coker yesterday,
not East Coast,
but West Coker, and talking to the community about making them more resilient and resistant to crime. They had community speed watch out at the time, which I was pleased to see, but also about making sure that we reboost the profile of the neighbourhood police officers. And
the profile or the numbers?
Both the profile and also the numbers.
So you might have to draw resources then out of the cities, like Bristol?
Well, I would like to reduce the amount of response officers and put those into neighbourhoods, because if the neighbourhoods can stop crime happening in the first place, you won't need so many response officers.
Okay. He's right.
Let me bring in Claire, because you have better word
as well.
I think there are, crimes that cut across geographically. We're seeing the rise of things like internet fraud. That's affecting many people across the region and some of the most vulnerable. So how do we go towards prevention? I agree that it's about prevention. So how do we get the messaging out? We'll know that there's things like safe and well visits, or there used to be. Is that an area that neighbourhood policing can do in our rural areas, so that we can go and check in on people and have that front-facing service? And also things, we've seen how we're adapting our lives, social distancing, pedestrianisation, cycling, being more environmentally friendly.
Okay.
So road safety is also something that cuts across
Let me just do it
geographically. We also know, again, as Heather said, county lines. We know that actually there are major issues in places like Yeovil, Weston, other areas in terms of drug, and we need to close that down.
One other question I want to ask you is about the Chief Constable. You have to appoint a new Chief Constable very shortly. Very quickly again, what will be your priorities? Let's start here.
We know that we've got budget cuts and we've got more savings to make. So what are we prioritising? I would say that there should be a deprioritisation of small-scale recreational drug possession. I don't think our approach to that is working at the moment. I also feel that empowering our youth is incredibly important. We don't have a youth-led crime panel, and I'd like to see one of those formed across the region.
Your priorities when you've got a future Chief Constable across the desk.
Exactly, and he or she has got to be able to provide a plan to secure what you're looking for. I want more police officers on the beat. I want to stop the closure of police stations, and I also want to bring back these specialist teams because they were so better at catching criminals.
Okay, Mark, your...
Well, I want a new Chief Constable that personifies the Pelian principles of preventing crime, can motivate the force, the whole police family, frontline police officers and the staff, to make Avon and Somerset safer.
Okay.
I want the new Chief Constable to work very strongly to prevent violence against women. Every 3 days a woman dies at the hands of a man, usually their ex-partner or partner, and it's a preventable crime, which should actually be, predictable, let's say, and it should be prevented, and that is just not happening at all.
Okay. And finally from you, John.
I've got a very ambitious plan of using these extra officers we're going to get back, as you say, David, to get back to where we were back in 2010 to improve the force. So I want a police chief that can inspire confidence amongst the officers and staff and work with partners to deliver a really good improvement plan for the area.
Okay. Wow, well, unfortunately, I have to stop the debate here because our time is up. I know it's flown past. My thanks to my guests, Mark Shelford, Kerry Barker, John Smith, Heather Shearer and Cleo Legge. From all of us here, enjoy the rest of your weekend and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.